Hey guys, this is Jeff from UnleashedPhones.com, and here's a quick review of the new iPad Air. The iPad Air is the latest in the line of iPads from Apple. Now this is a little hard to do on camera, but I'm going to try and show it to you. This is the iPad 2. This is what I've been using since I bought it on day one, and this is the new iPad Air. As you can see, it's much slimmer. You can actually fit an entire iPad Air into the iPad 2, as you can see there. So the bezel is much smaller, as you can see. It's also quite a bit slimmer as well. You can't actually tell on this camera, but it is. So you also notice that the design has changed quite a bit. This time around, Apple chose to use something similar to the iPad Mini's design, whereas previous iPads all had that, I think, sleeker look, in my opinion. So anywho, you either love or hate the design, but I think it's okay. It's not my favorite tablet design. I still think the iPad 2 was the best looking tablet of all time, but it's okay. It's a nice update, and let's face it, we really needed a better new design on the iPads. So this is what Apple has done. Just so you know, if you have an iPad 4, it is also much slimmer than the last iPad. It's about 0.0 inches shaved off its profile. Now it's just 0.3 inches thin versus last year's iPad, which was 0.37 inches. The weight is also down to just 1 pound. That's about 469 grams versus last year's iPad that was 652 grams by comparison. Now this might not seem like much. It might seem just dramatic on paper, but it is something you notice when you hold the iPad Air versus previous generation iPad. You'll notice how much lighter it is. But construction is just as solid as ever, with no compromises made in terms of quality, thanks to that brushed aluminum casing that they've used. You also see that the new iPad Air has a shiny iPad Apple logo versus the blacked-out logo that Apple used on the previous iPads. Now the main attraction at the front is the display. There's a 9.7-inch 2048 by 1536 pixel resolution IPS LCD Retina display. This might not seem like much, but it is what Apple has been using ever since the iPad 3, and it is really good. As you can see, text is really well defined, and icons all look really great. Even if I zoom in and show you can't actually tell any pixels on the screen because it really is that nice. And because it's an IPS display, you can use it outdoors in sunlight, and it's really bright. You can read text just fine outdoors. Viewing angles are also really good, as you can see right there, and all in all, it's a really nice sharp screen. Above the display, there's a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera that does an okay job for FaceTime HD calls. And below the display, you have the usual Apple home button. I'm not exactly sure as to why Apple didn't use the cool new biometric Touch ID thing that they used on the iPhone 5S. It is very cool, and it is very convenient to unlock the device with this cool little feature. But for whatever reason, Apple has chosen not to use the biometric fingerprint sensor thing with the iPad Air. So you have just the usual home button that can be used to get to the menu, or double tap to get to the multitasking menu, and so on and so forth. Coming to the rest of the iPad Air, you have the same amount of ports and buttons as before. On the right side, you have the volume buttons and the little mute switch that you can also use as a portrait orientation lock. At the top, you have the power button and screen lock button, and a lone little 3.5mm audio jack towards the side. At the bottom, you have the stereo speakers with the lightning cable port right there. All in all, it might seem like an incremental update to the last iPad, but Apple has admittedly made it thinner and lighter than before. I will note though that I am a little annoyed that they didn't use the Touch ID sensor thing. That was very cool on the iPhone 5S, but really there isn't much to hate about the new iPad. It really is a great looking tablet. Now coming to hardware, the iPad Air uses the same 64-bit dual-core Apple A7 chip that powers the iPhone 5S. As you can see, everything is really fast and really slick, and there's no lag at any instance. As such, the iPad Air is very fast and there's no instances of slowdown or lag anywhere at all. Even when you're running a processor intensive task like a 3D game or something, it still manages to work just fine. That being said, there are very few games or apps that use the 64-bit processor right now. Hopefully that'll change in the near future, but for now you have a lot of power that's not actually being utilized very well. Coming to software, the iPad runs iOS 7, no big surprise over there. iOS 7 by this time has come to a lot of devices, and we have covered it in our iPhone review. So there really isn't much new here that we can talk about. Moving on to messaging, the iPad keyboard has always been one of my favorites. It's really easy to type on, and you can split the keyboard in portrait to make it easier to type if you want. But I prefer to type in landscape mode where it feels like a full keyboard, and it does really work quite well. And lastly, coming to web browsing, the iPads have always been great to surf the internets on. That doesn't change with the iPad Air. The iPad Air is great at surfing the internet. Safari does a really good job of rendering pages really quickly with no slowdowns at all. All in all, the iPad has always been a great machine to surf the internet on, and that continues with the iPad Air. Alright, coming to multimedia, now this is a sore subject for the iPad because it has the same Photos app as before, where it sorts your photos in a collection of grids of thumbnails. The video app though can only play back a certain amount of codecs that are encoded in either MP4 or .mov or .m4v files. So if you want to play DivX files or Xvid files, you will have to download a third-party app like Cinex Player to play back more file formats. Alright, moving on to the camera. The iPad camera app is really bare bones. There really isn't much to do. You can just take a picture or take a square aspect ratio picture or switch to video mode. There really isn't much to do in the camera app. There isn't even this cool slow motion camera. I'm really not a big fan of taking pictures with my tablet, but the iPad Air's camera is a 5 megapixel camera with a backside illuminated sensor and f2.4 aperture lens, and as such it does a pretty good job of taking pictures. I would still advise you to use your phone for taking pictures, but if you have to take a picture with the iPad Air, it does a pretty good job. Alright, so moving on to battery life. With that slim body, you'd think the iPad Air would not have the same battery life as previous iPads, but you'd be wrong because you do get the same amount of battery life as before. The iPad Air lasted for about 8 hours of continuous video playback according to my tests. As such, it will easily last you a full day of heavy usage or even a couple days of moderate usage. I've always been a fan of the battery life on the iPads, and as such nothing has changed. It still lasts forever, and that's good to see. Alright, so to conclude, the iPad Air is a really great tablet, just like the iPads before. It has a nice balance of features that it brings to the table. I don't think you'll be disappointed by it if you do buy an iPad Air. It continues to be a really great looking tablet with a really nice design. It's very thin, very light,